Okay, so I want to do one more with you. So I've cleared off my board because those paintings were dry. And so I'm going to retape a piece of paper on. This one is going to be more of a sunset city is kind of what we're going to be going for on this one. All right, so we need to think about colors of a sunset. I have a picture in here just to kind of give you an idea of like colors of a sunset and what that might look like. And we're going to kind of fade from like a darker blue into kind of a peachy color. Okay, so we're going to just kind of do some colors that are very similar to this. So I like to mix those up ahead of time because we're going to do a variegated wash and it goes very, very quickly, and it's better if we have all of our colors prepped. So I'm going to put some red. I'm going to get kind of like a peachy color, but I'm going to have a little bit of red mixed in, so kind of, and I'm going to test these all out on a piece of paper before I even begin. And I do want some blue. Now, I don't want my blue to be super, super bright. I need it to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to add just a tiny bit of black to it. I don't want tons of black. Remember, black goes a long way. It'll definitely darken up something very, very quickly, quicker than you want it to. And I'm going to have some purple, but I don't want it to be like this super dark purple. I think I'm going to add a little bit of red to it. All right, so time to test out my colors. So I have a bunch of colors in my palette, but I'm not sure what they look like. So let's see what they look like. All right, so I have kind of this peachy. My water's starting to get yucky, so that didn't look all that pretty. I got some red. That red is very, very bright. I need to water it down. And okay. And then I have kind of this reddish purple. Ooh, that's a really pretty color. I like that one. And then I have hopefully a darker blue. Okay, so I need to make my darker blue a little bit darker blue. All right. So I have my colors ready, and now before I even paint though, I want to give this kind of star effect. I want some stars to be visible. So I'm going to use the resist method using my crayon. Now I know it's hard to see because I'm doing white on white, but I am pressing hard and I'm doing some stars and I'm doing it probably in the top 1/3 of my paper. All right. Now, in order to do this next effect, I really want to use a larger flat brush, all right, because we have a huge area that we're painting and we need to paint it in a very short amount of time, and we're also wanting to blend it. So using the bigger brush is much better. All right, so I'm going to put some of this is supposed to be dark blue, but it looks very black. Maybe add a little bit of blue to that and kind of fade it out. I'm running out of blue in my paint palette, and that's part of the problem. So we got to work pretty quickly whenever it comes to this blending out. So we're doing like variegated washes. So to blend that out, I need to add a little bit of water, and then I can take my next color and kind of put that on top and blend that in. Now it doesn't have to look perfectly smooth. If there is like some spots that aren't blended perfectly, that's okay. Don't stress out about it. It's watercolor. It's supposed to be kind of loose and fun and free. All right, I'm going to use some water and blend that out, and then I can add my next color, which I think is going to be more like a red. Now I want it to fade. It's very intense up here as far as the color, but as I go down, I want it to be lighter because that's where my buildings are going to go and I want to be able to see my buildings, okay? All right, so fading from kind of a dark blue, very sky night into more of a sunset sky down here. Okay, so we have started our background for our final watercolor painting. And this one's going to be buildings. So here's an example. of kind of what we're striving for. So the goal here is to make it look almost like the buildings are in fog. So I do have some photo references to kind of help me. So have this one where you can see the tops of the buildings, you can see a little bit of the windows, but you can't necessarily see the bottom. And then I also have kind of the tops here of like kind of this is more of a residential area where you can see some power lines. And so we're going to just create kind of like a city scene. And we can improvise on this. So I can use all of these tools to create some buildings here. Now, if you feel most comfortable drawing with a ruler, you're more than welcome to do that. I think I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and hope for the best. So we want buildings that look up close, and then we also want buildings that are a little bit further away. Now, I'm not going to worry about drawing the bottom of my buildings because that's going to actually be vanishing into the fog or the foggy abyss, okay? So right now I'm just going to draw some different rectangles or building types. And I'm going to have them, like this one's further back, so it's definitely going to be smaller since it's further back. And I can alter the shapes a little bit so they look a little bit different from each other and not being all the same exact shape, because typically buildings are different. Like if we look at the tops of these buildings, they are a little bit different. And we have some short ones and some tall ones and overlaps and everything else. And so that's kind of what we need to draw in our little scene here. I might have like a little house kind of nestled in here. So take some time to just kind of draw out some things that could represent our buildings here. I can also add some tops of some trees if I want. So you kind of determine what you want. So I have some basic outlines here of buildings, but I also want to know where my windows are. So perhaps the buildings that are in the far, far back, we're not necessarily going to see the windows because they're so far back we don't see those details. But the ones that are a little bit closer to us are going to have some windows. So I am actually going to draw those on because I'm going to mask them off with my masking fluid before I start painting. Typically windows reflect what is in front of them. So the sunset scenes will, be reflected in these windows. So I want to keep those colors. I don't want to necessarily paint over them. So I'm going to use my masking fluid to make that happen. So I have some windows drawn. And then I'm going to use my masking fluid to mask off those areas. Now these are very small areas, so I'm going to use a small brush. Now the thing is with masking fluid, we really don't want our masking fluid to ruin our brush. So we may have to rinse our brush every once in a while just to keep our brush safe. So I'm going to quickly do this, but every once in a while maybe dunk it in my water just to keep the masking fluid from solidifying on my brush. So I'm going to rinse, and then I'm going to wipe off, and then I'm going to continue masking. The masking fluid, if it solidifies in our brush, it will be ruined, and we don't want to ruin our brushes. So I don't have to put this masking fluid on very thick, and the thicker you put it on, the longer it takes to dry. So I'm not doing a super thick coat of this. I'm just putting a little bits. So by rinsing every once in a while, I have saved my brush. I might have little goobers at the end, but for the most part, it's still saved. All right, so that needs to dry. While that's drying, though, I can work on some pen work. So there are some things that I just don't think I feel comfortable doing with a paintbrush. And so I like to incorporate some pen work into this one. So when I'm looking at this, like for instance, the lines, the power lines, I would imagine that if I would paint these power lines that they would probably bleed all together and not look like power lines anymore. So because of that, I'm going to come in with a pen and do some pen work for my power lines. And I honestly feel so much more confident whenever I'm doing the pen lines with the pen, or those lines with the pen. There's some balconies, so that I use tiny little lines. I can even do the like wire work or the antennas on top of buildings. So the really fine, it's not cheating doing real fine work with a pen. It's okay to do that. Choose what you feel most comfortable with, and if it is in fact using a pen for those areas, then that's what I would do. So I'm just adding a few little like balconies kind of sticking out. All right, so for the most part, believe it or not, my masking fluid is already dry because I just put on really thin coats. So I can actually start with my painting. All right, so we are really only going to use black for this, but we're going to use um, different consistencies of black. We are going to start with our furthest buildings that are furthest away, and then we're going to build up. Remember, watercolor always works lightest to darkest. So my lightest black or my lightest gray is what I'm going to work with first. So I'm going to get my brush ready. And so the only thing I really need to activate in my paint is black today. And I'm going to just take and put a little bit of black. Now I am going to need to test out my colors because black just looks like black in there. All right, so I just put a little bit of black. It doesn't look like a whole lot. I'm going to add some water. Now I'm going to test this out and see. I really want this to be a very light gray because it's my furthest away and it's pretty foggy, okay? So the darker it gets, the less atmospheric it looks. So let's keep it pretty light. So I'm going to add a little bit more water to that. So I'm going to use something like this. I think that looks pretty good. Now use a brush that works for the job. If it's a very small area, I would keep with using a very small brush. One of our detail brushes are probably the best for like the tiny little small areas. And then for the bigger buildings, we could get a little bit bigger. So I'm going to use a very small brush here. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just put this in one of my far away buildings at the top. I am going to graduate that out. Using a graduated wash, I'm going to graduate that out. So I'm going to use a little bit of water. Not too much water. This is a very small area. If I use too much water, it'll get a little bit out of control. So I'm going to use that water to kind of graduate it out. So then it kind of fades. And that'll add to that atmospheric feeling that it's really foggy. All right, so I have one back here. So another thing to think about is that we have to think about, oh no, I just splattered. Doing things, those can become birds, I guess. Because, going from furthest away to the closest to us. So the next one is going to be this one, and that one's still pretty far away. So I'm going to keep with this same gray. And it looks really dark, I think because I put so much paint on there. I'm using a very big brush for this, and I should probably be using a smaller brush. All right, so I have the top of the building. I'm going to rinse my brush, and then I'm going to fade that out. All right, so I have faded that out, so it kind of looks like there's going to be some fog down here. Now, the next building that's like closest to me is probably going to be this one right here. Okay, so I'm going to do that one, but I want it to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to add a little bit more black to my paint, and I'm going to check it and see if it's a little bit darker. It is a tiny bit darker, so I feel like that'll work. All right, so this building is actually kind of right behind another building. It's kind of nestled up right there. So I'm going to put some of my black solution. It's black and gray, and then I'm going to graduate it out. So this is very repetitive, right? This is the same thing over and over again. All right. Now I cannot do this building next because I just did this building. If I were to put paint on this building, it would bleed into my other building, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to flip it up and I'm going to come over here. Now I feel like these two buildings are probably about the same distance for me, so I'm okay with using that same solution that I just used on this one here. I'm going to increase my brush size because this is a pretty big building. It's important to keep your lines straight up and down so the buildings don't seem like they're crashing. Okay, so the next one I probably want to do, I have this big building. It doesn't even have any windows. It's just this big kind of rectangle, and I think I want to do that, but I want to be careful. I'm going to leave a little bit of space in between those two buildings so it doesn't start bleeding together. I feel like it's maybe a little bit closer, so I'm going to add a little bit of black to my paint, and I'm going to check it. All right, so that's a little bit darker, and I'm going to graduate it out with a little bit of water. All right, so at some point we probably have to leave a little bit of time for drying. Depending on how you have your buildings located, you may have to have some drying time in between, and that's okay. It's important to just pause and let things dry before we do our next layer of buildings before, so we don't end up ruining our buildings, okay? Like having them bleed all together. Now I'm going to test, and I feel like this building right here is pretty dry, so I feel like I can do this building right here without it bleeding, but you're going to have to, test it and see what's happening with that building. If it doesn't graduate it out, get it a little bit wet and then add a little more paint, and then it should fade. All right, I'm going to do a little bit of my power line. I switched to my smaller brush. All right, so I feel like my city is actually coming along pretty good. Just feeling to see where we're at with things. I have this little house here that I need to, so these two things, I have a tree, or the top of a tree, and then I have this house. I feel like those are the closest to me. And so I'm going to need to do the darkest layer on those, I think. But again, I'm going to fade it out very quickly because I want it to look like it's foggy. So now I'm going to use inspiration from this one as far as this house goes. It looks like I have kind of like a side that's like kind of darker here. So I'm going to like include that darker part and kind of separate the two sides. So I'm going to do this first, and then I can move to this. I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So on a foggy day, the things that are closest to you are going to be the darkest. And then the further they go back, they are going to get lighter and lighter. So that's why we are making this house that's closest to us the darkest. Now I don't want this to be pure, just nothing. I do need to have that. I want to make it a little bit lighter, but not completely light like it is right now. So I need to add a little bit of water to my solution. All right, so I'm going to do the tops of my trees. Now I did add a little bit of water to my solution, so I'm going to add a little bit more color and get it dark again. For trees, just make them very kind of haphazard. We don't want to see a lot of detail because of the time of day, there's not going to be a lot of detail, and honestly, we're going to just see the tops of the tree, and then we're going to fade it out. Just keep it very kind of loose and very organic. The one building I'm not particularly fond of the two buildings back here. I feel like it doesn't necessarily look like it's foggy back there. It almost looks like my buildings are incomplete. So upon that reflection, I am going to add a little bit more color and try to fade it out a little bit better. All right, I think I might like that a little bit better. So the last step is the step of removing our masking fluid, and we cannot do that until it is completely dry. If it's not completely dry and we start rubbing this stuff off, we're gonna actually start rubbing our paper off too. And I really just don't want that to happen. So I'm gonna add some trees here, just because. So we need to make sure that it's completely dry before we remove that masking fluid. And once it is completely dry, then we can just rub off that masking fluid and our painting will be done.